By day, she was the quiet wife of a returning soldier, her love a beacon in the humid haze of the Louisiana bayou. But when the sun sank below the cypress trees, a different kind of hunger awakened, a curse brought home from a distant war. The air in St. Landry Parish in the summer of 1978 was a living thing. It was a thick, wet blanket of heat that smelled of sweet decay and the dark, still water of the bayou. For John, returning from the humid jungles of Vietnam, it was a familiar kind of oppression, a suffocating embrace he had hoped to leave behind. He was a man made of quiet, sharp edges, his eyes holding a permanent distance that his wife, Eliza, tried so desperately to bridge. She saw the war in the tremor of his hands, in the way he would stare at the impenetrable line of cypress trees that bordered their small, isolated property, as if expecting an ambush. But she was hopeful. He was home. That was all that mattered. Their house was a small, clapboard structure, its white paint surrendering to the relentless humidity, turning a soft, mottled gray. It was the house she had grown up in, a place of supposed safety. But with John's return, he brought with him the ghosts of a foreign land, and they seemed to seep into the very wood of the walls. One evening, as the cicadas began their deafening chorus, John presented her with a gift. He pulled it from the bottom of his duffel bag, a piece of his past he had kept hidden. It was a small music box, carved from a dark, unfamiliar wood, almost the color of dried blood. It was not a box in the traditional sense, but a miniature house with a steeply pitched roof and intricate swirling designs that were not quite floral, not quite figurative. At its peak was a small, serene face, its eyes closed, its mouth a thin, ambiguous line. "I brought this back for you," John said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "For us. The old woman who gave it to me, she said it was a spirit house, to protect our home, keep the bad things out." Eliza took it from him. The wood was cool and smooth to the touch, and it felt impossibly heavy for its size. There was a small, tarnished brass key in the back. As she turned it, a melody began to play. It was a tune of just a few notes, played on a tinny, metallic comb, but the melody was deeply alien. It was a discordant, sorrowful tune that seemed to hang in the thick, humid air, a sound that did not belong amongst the familiar chorus of the bayou. She placed it on the mantelpiece, a souvenir from a world away, a dark, wooden heart that had begun to beat in the center of their home. The unraveling began not with a scream, but with a whisper, a series of strange events that frayed the edges of their quiet life. Old man Thibodeau, who owned the neighboring property a half-mile down the dirt road, was the first to notice. He found one of his prize goats one morning lying dead in his pen, his throat torn, but not in a way he recognized. There was no shredded flesh, no signs of a struggle. It was just empty. Drained of its blood, its body left like a discarded wineskin. A week later, another one. The whispers started in the local town, hushed talk of the rougarou, the Cajun werewolf, awakened by the oppressive heat of the summer. Eliza, meanwhile, was fading. The vibrant, hopeful woman who had welcomed John home began to recede, replaced by a pale, listless shadow. A deep, anemic weariness settled into her bones. She complained of being constantly thirsty, yet water never seemed to slake it. She developed a strange and sudden aversion to the rich, cooked food she had always loved. The smell of fried catfish or jambalaya, once a source of comfort, now made her nauseous. One night, John awoke to an empty bed. He found her in the kitchen, bathed in the pale blue light of the open refrigerator. She was standing completely still, transfixed by a package of raw ground meat he had bought for dinner. Her eyes, wide and vacant, reflected the dim light, and a thin line of saliva traced a path from the corner of her mouth to her chin. When he touched her shoulder, she didn't flinch. She simply turned her head slowly, her gaze unfocused, before he gently led her back to bed. The sleepwalking became a nightly occurrence, but it was the mornings that brought the true creeping dread. John began to notice small, muddy footprints on the wooden floor of their bedroom. They were Eliza's size, but they were always caked in the dark, rich mud of the bayou, and they always led from her side of the bed, out the bedroom door, and toward the front of the house. He never saw her leave, and she never remembered her nocturnal journeys. But every morning, the evidence was there, a silent, muddy testament to the fact that something was taking his wife out into the suffocating darkness of the swamp while he slept. Sheriff Frank Broussard was a man carved from the cypress of the parish he served. He was pragmatic, his face a roadmap of sun and worry, and he had little time for the superstitious talk that flowed through the bayou like the muddy water itself. When the reports of Thibodeau's goats reached him, he dismissed the talk of the rougarou with a tired sigh. To him, it was a predator, plain and simple, a panther maybe, or a pack of wild dogs driven to strange behavior by the heat. He started his investigation with logic, with the methodical process of elimination. He mapped the locations of the kills. He spoke to the handful of families who lived in that isolated stretch of land. And the more he investigated, the more one location became the quiet, gravitational center of the mystery. The small, gray house at the end of the old logging road, the one where the returning veteran, John, lived with his young wife. One sweltering afternoon, Broussard drove his patrol car down the rutted road, the air so thick with humidity it felt like he was driving through water. He found John on the front porch, oiling a rifle, his movements precise and mechanical. The sheriff's questions were direct. Had they seen or heard anything unusual? Any strange animals? John's answers were clipped, his eyes constantly flicking towards the dark line of trees. No, he hadn't seen anything. Yes, he'd heard about Thibodeau's goats. A wild dog, probably. It was then that Eliza came to the screen door, a glass of water in her hand. The sheriff was taken aback by her appearance. She was a wraith, her skin a translucent, sickly white, her eyes wide and dark and a drawn, gaunt face. She offered him the water with a trembling hand, her gaze vacant, as if she were looking straight through him. Broussard, a man who had seen his share of hardship and sickness, felt a genuine pang of concern. The woman looked like she was wasting away. He thanked her for the water and made his excuses. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the oppressive atmosphere of the home. It was a place of deep, unspoken misery. He had come to investigate a dead animal, but he had found something far more disturbing. He had found a house that felt like it was holding its breath, and a woman whose eyes held the same profound and unsettling distance as her husband's. He had come looking for a predator, but his gut told him the real trouble, whatever it was inside that house. A man like Frank Broussard trusts his gut. Logic and evidence could build a case, but it was instinct that told you where to look for the truth. 2 more of Thibodeau's goats were found drained and discarded, and the sheriff knew he could no longer treat this as a simple animal attack. The fear in the community was becoming a palpable thing, and it all radiated from that one silent house. That night, he decided to conduct a stakeout. He didn't have a warrant, didn't have any real evidence, just a gnawing certainty that he was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. He parked his car a quarter-mile down the road, the engine off, and made his way on foot through the humid darkness, the air alive with the chirping of insects. He found a spot behind a thicket of palmettos that gave him a clear, if distant, view of the house. For hours, nothing happened. The house was a dark silhouette against the moonless, star-dusted sky. Then he saw it. a light bobbing and weaving through the cypress trees at the edge of the property. At first, he thought it was a feu follet, the swamp gas that local legend claimed was the souls of lost children. But this light moved with an unnatural purpose, a slow, deliberate glide. It wasn't a flame. It was a soft, phosphorescent glow, a sickly, green-white light like rotting wood. He raised the binoculars to his eyes, his hands slick with sweat. The light drifted from the swamp and across the overgrown yard, heading directly for the house. As it drew closer, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The light was not a single point. It was a dangling, glistening mass, and above it, floating in the air, was a shape his brain recognized with a sickening lurch of absolute, primal terror. It was Eliza's head. There was no body, just her head, her long, dark hair trailing behind her like seaweed in a slow current. Her eyes were closed, her face serene, almost peaceful. But below her severed neck, her internal organs, the stomach, the intestines, the faintly pulsing heart hung in a grotesque glowing pendulum. Broussard felt the world tilt on his axis, the familiar sounds of the bayou night fading into a roaring in his ears. He was a man of law, of facts, of tangible reality, and he was watching a woman's disembodied head float towards her own home. He watched, paralyzed, as the horrifying apparition reached the side of the house. It did not try the door or a window. It simply drifted towards the wall of the bedroom, and with a faint, ethereal shimmer, it phased directly through the wood, disappearing inside. The unholy light vanished, and the house was once again a dark, silent shape against the night sky. The sheriff lowered his binoculars, his body trembling. The logical, ordered world he had inhabited his entire life shattered into a million impossible pieces. The sun rose the next morning, but for Frank Broussard, the world remained a dark and terrifying place. He had not slept. He had sat in his car until dawn. The impossible image of what he had witnessed burned into his mind. He drove back to the house, not as a sheriff investigating a crime, but as a man seeking answers from a nightmare. He found John on the porch, exactly as he had been the day before, cleaning the same rifle, his movements a hollow, practiced ritual. But this time, Broussard didn't ask about the livestock. He didn't bother with pretenses. His voice was low and hoarse. "I saw her last night, John." John froze. The rifle clattered from his hands onto the wooden porch. He didn't feign ignorance. He simply sagged, the sharp, controlled edges of the soldier dissolving into the broken form of a defeated man. He looked at the sheriff, and for the first time, Broussard saw not distance in his eyes, but a profound, bottomless agony. He finally broke. The confession tumbled out of him, a torrent of guilt and horror. He knew what was happening to Eliza. He had known for weeks. He told Broussard about the music box. He had found it not in a village, but in the ruins of a desecrated temple deep in the jungle. An old monk, one of the few survivors of a massacre, had warned him. He told him the box was not a spirit house for protection, but a cage for a hungry spirit from that land, a Krasue. The monk had said that the curse latches on to the purest heart it can find and feeds on the life around it. John, in his traumatized state, had dismissed it as the superstitious ramblings of a dying man. He had brought it home as a trophy, a beautiful object from a land of ugliness. But the curse had been real. It had latched on to Eliza, the kindest, purest soul he had ever known, and it was consuming her from the inside out. He confessed that he knew about her nocturnal journeys. He'd been following her, trying to contain her, to clean up after her. He was not just a husband, he had become the keeper of a monster. Broussard listened, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture more tragic and horrifying than he could ever imagined. He looked past John, through the screen door, and saw Eliza sitting at the kitchen table, slowly sipping a glass of water, her face as pale and fragile as a pressed flower. She was a prisoner in her own body, and John was a prisoner in his own home, bound by a love for the woman who, through no fault of her own, had become a nocturnal horror. There would be no arrest. There was no monster to be hunted, no evil to be vanquished. There was only a curse brought home from a distant war, nestled in a beautiful, carved wooden box on the mantelpiece. The sheriff stood on the porch, a man of the law rendered powerless as he watched two people he could not help, trapped in a quiet, domestic tragedy. He got back in his car and drove away, the sun beginning its slow descent towards the cypress trees, the oppressive, humid air already promising the arrival of another night. What is more terrifying, the monsters we fight in foreign lands, or the ones we bring home to the people we love?